I just rewrote the ending to Dragontown, my first ever D&D adventure zine, and I think it's going to be really, really cool. So let's talk about it. So when I first started this Dragontown project, I knew that I wanted to create a cool setting that had a fun, simple starting adventure to go along with it. My idea was to create a typical fantasy town with a few fun and whimsical twists. I knew that this was going to be a big project and my first published adventure, so I wanted this to represent my ideal version of D&D. You know, I thought to myself, if I were to live in a fantasy town, what would I want that place to look like? But you know, as I was writing this, I realized that idea doesn't necessarily make for a good adventure. You know, it's probably a good place for an adventuring group to stop along the way and rest and maybe find some quests, but there isn't much actual danger going on in this idealized fantasy town. So the typical way of constructing an interesting story is to introduce some conflict. So you disrupt the status quo so your protagonist, or in this case the players, can come along, fix things, and return this town back to normal. But here's the thing about writing a D&D adventure for another dungeon master to run. It's not like writing a normal story. See, in D&D, our protagonists, the players, are active participants. They're not passive observers. So that means we, as dungeon masters, explain the setting, introduce some conflict, and then see where the players take it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some light spoilers for the Dragontown zine ahead. So if you're trying to stay spoiler free, maybe save the rest of this video for another time. Okay, so the setup for the Dragontown adventure is the dragon mayor has gone missing, and now trouble is starting to pop up all around town, and it's up to the players to figure out what's happened and get things back to normal. So my initial instinct, like most D&D adventures, was to have a big final conflict with the villain at the end. And once the villain is defeated, things in Dragontown go back to normal and the players feel like heroes. And I guess really that can still happen. That's absolutely one of the possibilities of how the Dragontown adventure can end. But I thought that maybe that was just a little too straightforward. So I spent some more time thinking about it. Actually, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. And I realized that it shouldn't be up to me, the author of this adventure, but it should be up to the players to decide how this whole thing turns out. You know, they get to decide how their adventure ends, not me. And really that's the way it should be in a D&D adventure, because, you know, because this is a role-playing game. It's not a comic book or a movie or a novel. And just by me deciding that I'm not going to have a conclusion to this adventure, instead leave it open for the players to decide, made this whole project way more interesting. And you know, of course there is an end point to the adventure. I have suggestions about how the DM can react to what the players do in certain situations, and hopefully it's enough that no matter what the players come up with, the DM feels like they have enough information to end the game properly. But yeah, it's not me writing the end of the adventure. And that's such a simple thing, and I feel like maybe people that write D&D adventures like know that really obviously. I don't know, because I came from writing comics and telling stories where there's a beginning, middle, and end. This is a new realization to me because this is my first attempt at writing a proper adventure for somebody else to run as a DM. Once I realized this, it's opened up the project even more and makes it feel so much cooler. So, you know, the players are exploring this town, they're talking to the townsfolk, they're helping them, they're learning about Dragontown as a place, what's going on in the town right now, and also they're uncovering the history of it. And then, instead of just meeting the villain at the end of the adventure, they meet someone who's actually trying to help the people of Dragontown. They're just doing it in a different way than a typical group of adventuring heroes would do it. So instead of being just a big bad evil villain, this antagonist is actually just going to give the players the last little bit of information to fill in the puzzle of Dragontown. But then the twist is the story that the players are experiencing by playing through this adventure is maybe a little bit bigger than it seems initially. You know, it's not just an idyllic fantasy town. There's something darker and more dangerous lurking below. And hopefully by this point, I mean by the end of the adventure, the players are invested in this place. Hopefully they'll care about a few of the people in Dragonstown, and they'll have opinions about how this story should move forward. You know, so will the players restore the status quo, or will they change Dragontown forever? Or maybe they just take some treasure and peace out and go on to the next adventure somewhere else. It's no longer up to me, it's up for the players to decide. And I think by working on this adventure for so long and finally coming to this realization, I have figured out how to properly write a D&D adventure. So, you know, Dragontown can be just a straightforward adventure, and I still think that's totally awesome. I mean, that's what I've been making this whole time, basically. And you know, most likely the players will probably still play the adventure that way, but by actually giving them the choices to make along the way, it's going to make them feel so much more invested in this adventure. You know, they aren't just playing through the story, but they're actually creating it. And that is awesome. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is that if you're a DM and you're writing your own adventure, whether it's big or small, I think it's really easy to just write a story. We all know how to do that. Beginning, middle, and end kind of story stuff. But I don't think that's what makes a good D&D adventure. The story is what happens when your players interact with the characters, the setting, and the conflict that you as a DM have created. So I think the lesson here is, instead of writing a story, just come up with a cool place, fill it with some interesting people, and then you just shake up the status quo of this world that you've created to give the players some incentive and get them invested in exploring your world a little bit more. So I hope talking about this realization I have was helpful, and once the book is out in the world, I think I'll talk more about this epiphany, because there's another layer to it that I think is super, super cool and has me so excited to make more RPG adventures, but it's super heavy spoilery, so I want the book to be out there before I get further into this subject. So as far as progress goes on the Dragontown zine, everything is illustrated, the layout is complete, all the illustrations and text is in there, just needs proofreading, and then I gotta like nudge things around in the layout just to make sure all the spacing is perfect and everything looks perfect. It's got to be perfect. But it's very, 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 very close to being done and sent off to the printer. And I'll talk more about that on the channel here very soon. If you have no idea what Dragontown is, check out the playlist that's linked in the description. I've made a bunch of videos on it, and if all this sounds really cool to you, there is a pre-order link in the description as well, where you can pre-order the book on my website. And yes, let me know what you think in the comments of this idea. Maybe it's a super obvious thing, but this is unlocked writing for Dungeons and Dragons for me, and I'm super, super excited about it. If you're here at the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. I super appreciate you, and I will see you in the next one. See ya!